Okay, so good evening, everybody. So for those of you joining from the various astronomical clubs across the islands that are joining on Zoom, welcome this evening. I'll give a little bit of a Zoom introduction in a moment, just to let everybody know that we're also streaming live on Facebook. So for those of you that don't want to make an appearance, you may want to switch off your video. Okay. So this evening, I'm delighted to welcome back Dr. Martin Braddock, who will be giving a presentation titled Working with Lunar Regolith, Challenges and Opportunities for Agriculture and Human Health. I should probably point out that the image you can see on the screen is not a true representation of the moon, but I'm sure Martin will explain a bit more during his talk. Martin gave a presentation for us a couple of months ago, so I think rather than any detailed introduction, I think it's probably best if I just hand straight over to Martin and let him run through the details of his talk.
That's great, thank you very much, Gordon. So let me just share my screen. Go. All Zoom experts. Oh, there we go. Is that visible to everybody?
Yeah, I'm seeing it fine, Martin.
Okay, thank you very much. So great pleasure again to come back and talk to you. And you'd be surprised how many people do think that this is a real photo. I guess the world that we live in today means that it's not that difficult to give an image to somebody and then they'll believe it. And they said to me, how do people pick the fruit? I said, oh dear, it's not a real picture. So the title of the talk, as you can see, is on working with lunar regolith and what are the challenges in particular for human health and agriculture, but also what are the opportunities. And it's probably fairly topical to consider the moon and not forget it at the time when everybody's eyes are on Mars, because there are, as we know, very serious thoughts about returning to the moon and possibly colonizing it. So if I go to the next one, so I think when I look at the audience, I'm probably preaching to the converted, is that there are a number of us that were alive when these photographs were taken. And I still sort of slightly pinch myself at the quality of some of them when you think that they were taken over 50 years ago. And by today's standards, of course, as we all know, the advance in electronics is fantastic. But when you look at the quality of some of these images, it still sort of makes me slightly in awe of what was done so long ago. So, of course, this is the Earthrise from the moon. And as you can see, at least in this shot, the impression is given of a nice flat surface, little bits of rock here and there, and that's it. And if we look at in a little bit more detail, you can start to see, even if you didn't know anything about it, you can start to see, well, there are large rocks, there are small rocks, and it looks sandy. It looks as if there is a surface of dust there. And of course, that's what there is, and this is what we call lunar regolith. So as an outline, what I'll go through for everybody is, what is lunar regolith? And there's probably experts amongst you that know it already, but for those who don't, just describe it. What's it made of? Why do we want to study it, and how can we study it? And can we grow plants in it? And that's been a topic of some speculation for quite some time. What might it do to human beings, which is very relevant, particularly if we think about returning to the moon for any period of time, let alone colonizing it. And then how do we protect ourselves? And then to ask the question at the end, are we going back to the moon? So just by way of a starter, and again, just look at the quality of that image. I mean, it could be taken with an iPhone today. I mean, it's amazing to see that this was taken probably around about 50 years ago, I think 49 years ago. So what is lunar regolith? It refers to any layer of material or rock, or any layer of material covering solid rock. And it can come in the form of dust or broken fragments, etc. And how's it formed? It's been formed by billions of years of micrometeorite impact that still happens today. And again, for those of you who have followed this, you'll know that spacecraft themselves were damaged, and those that are left have been heavily damaged by micrometeorite impact. And it's simply derived from classical Greek, regos meaning blanket, and lithos meaning rock. And as you can see here, this image from Apollo 15 to me is really quite sensational. So a little bit more detail. So the whole of the surface, or at least the parts that aren't very heavily cratered, are covered with this fine powder of regolith. And nearly the entire surface is covered. The bedrock is visible only in very steep craters. And it's estimated to be about 4 to 5 meters deep in places, and as deep as 15 meters in some of the older highland areas. And again, this caused a lot of consternation, of course, in mission planners who were thinking back in the 1960s, and even when the lunar landing took place in 1969, would the feet of the lunar module rest nicely on the surface, as we all know that they did, or would they drop into the lunar regolith itself? And of course, we know what happened today, but that speculation was really rife right up to the impact of the lunar landing. And these pictures taken from Apollo 16, and again, a wonderful picture of an astronaut here with a rake collecting samples. So this is a little bit of a breakdown here from David Kring in the LPI on what is lunar regolith. And it's composed of all sorts of molecules. And again, for the geochemists amongst you, you'll know this much better than me. But agglutinates, orange glass spherules or vitrifiers, some green glass here, some amorphosites, basalts, breccia, and glass spherules. So if that's the composition of lunar regolith, that automatically starts making you think that wouldn't be good to breathe in. That wouldn't necessarily be good to get on your skin. It wouldn't be good to get in your eyes. And what could you do with it? That's not really soil. That's not what we know as soil on Earth. So why is dust a problem? And dust on the surface is a problem. I won't tempt fate here by getting out of this and loading the video on Wikimedia. But it's very interesting, because this is the Lunar Rover effectively doing the equivalent of wheel spins on the moon. And it blows up a lot of dust. And of course, because there's no atmosphere on the moon, and of course there's very little gravity, as we know, about 1/6 of that on Earth, the dust stays and travels. And that really means that anything that provides impact, even the landing of lunar modules themselves, throw up an awful lot of dust. And because the electrostatic forces positively charge each dust particle, it tends to make them stick to everything. And that includes the electronics, it includes the astronaut spacesuits, it includes pretty much everything that dust can stick to. So this is a real problem, and it's a problem today that, as you'll see a little bit later on, all of the space agencies that have an interest in returning to the moon really want to try and tackle. So dust everywhere, and I put this together just taking a look at 2 astronauts' experience here. So again, this is 51 years ago in Apollo 12, and this is a quote from Alan Bean, as you can see. After liftoff, a great quantity of dust floated free within the cabin that made breathing without a helmet difficult, and particles there disturbed vision. That must have been pretty frightening for people in the lunar module, thinking that also, apart from the fact that their vision was disturbed, that they found it difficult to breathe. You can imagine the consternation again that there must have been back at mission control, hearing that type of thing from astronauts that of course have nowhere to go. Probably one of the most well documented cases of almost an adverse event is Harrison Schmitt experiencing what was the equivalent, I suppose, of lunar hay fever, and of course the only astronaut to have experienced lunar hay fever, but really an allergic response, a classical allergic response, just as we might have on Earth to pollen or to dust mites. So as he's quoted here back in 1972, this is the biggest problem that the space agencies recognized at that time. And I think it's fair to say it is still the biggest problem today. There's always the possibility that engineering systems might fail simply because the dust gets into places that it shouldn't do. So again, some wonderful photos here. Some of them a little blurry, the one in the middle on the right a little blurry, but photo on the left here very clearly shows on Mitchell's legs and boots, Regolith, or the dust component of Regolith adhering to his spacesuit, and the standard practice that you'll find if you trawl through some of the NASA files is as astronauts descended back into the lunar module, they do what you and I would do if we had snow on our boots. They actually banged their feet on the steps of the lunar module to try and get as much dust off as possible. In the middle, this is Gene Cernan, and again you can see dust on his spacesuit. And perhaps a little worrying is that when he'd taken his helmet off, you can see it on the left and you can see it's a little blurred on the right, but this was the best photo available at the time. You can see that there's dust there on his t-shirt and actually on his face, which means of course that that dust has had contact with his skin. And then on the right hand side here, this is Jack Schmitt again, or Harrison Schmitt, as he was known affectionately at the time, showing the presence of lunar dust pretty much on his entire spacesuit, certainly up to his shoulders. So dust is a real problem, and it is brought back into the lunar module. So what can we do to try and understand some of the characteristics of it? And of course, lunar regolith sampling is one of the things that all of the astronauts did throughout the missions. That was part of the reason for going to the moon in the first place. And this is Buzz Aldrin's lunar footprint. That is probably one of the best known images in the world, taken by him in 1969. And of course, lunar dust and lunar samples were returned. And this photo on the right here that was taken in 1969, I think, if I remember correctly, was found not that long ago by accident. It was something that was put in the archive somewhere and actually discovered very recently, or relatively recently. So lunar regolith sampling, for the reasons that we'll come on to in a moment, was at that time very much an aim of all of the missions. So what has been brought back in total? And in total, over the Apollo mission period between 1969 and 72, roundabout, let's round it up, let's call it 400 kilograms of rocks, pebbles, sand and dust, which has returned an enormous number of separate samples. The three automated Soviet missions returned about 1/3 of a kilo from 3 other sites. All of these samples are held in the Johnson Space Center, which is the chief repository, at least, for the Apollo mission samples. And many, of course, of these are distributed each year for university investigation and for teaching projects. This is what's helping build the next generation of scientists. So if we think a little bit about the composition, so if we confine ourselves very broadly to the lowlands and the highlands, and think about the lunar composition and now compare it, at least on an element basis, with that of lunar soil, you can see at first sight, when we look at the elements from oxygen down to hydrogen, there's not too many dissimilarities. There are some dissimilarities, but they are probably fairly equal in terms of relative concentration of elements. So that starts to get you thinking a little bit, well, maybe lunar dust and lunar regolith isn't quite perhaps as useless as it might have seemed when we first started. At least as an elemental composition, there may be some similarities. There are clearly areas where there are differences, but there may be some similarities. And of course, the fact that there are 400 kilos, there or thereabouts, may sound a lot, but of course that was over a period of 3 years, 50 years ago, and those samples soon run out. So if you want to do any studies, you have to at least try and get some comparisons done. And in this particular case here, and this is taken from a summary of a number of publications, and now will be published in November this year, where what I've tried to do here is to collect some physical properties of soil from various locations on Earth and compared it with samples of subsurface regolith at different depths. And to cut a long story short, again, when you look at the bulk density and the particle density, and even the porosity, there aren't huge differences between samples on Earth versus subsurface regolith at either 0 to 15 or 30 to 60 centimeters deep. There are some differences, and what I've tried to pick out here is samples that represent decomposed peat right the way through to traffic pan and sandy soil. And you can see we're not too dissimilar. We're a little bit out in some instances, but we're not too dissimilar. And I mentioned just before this slide that with 400 kilos, it sounds a lot, but there's not a huge amount that you can do if you have lots of people clamoring to conduct some studies with your authentic lunar regolith. So what do you do? And if you want more samples, you make your own and you keep calm. Some of the work that's been done quite extensively now, and it's been quite an industry since the 1980s, is to isolate areas of what are called lunar regolith simulants. And again, what I've done here is summarized at least, I think I missed one actually in the end, but I've summarized here at least the most popular lunar regoliths that are used and published in the literature. And without going through these in fine detail, they represent a number of countries, clearly. They represent the interest of a number of space agencies. The ones that are, by and large, used the most in the scientific literature are JSC, after Johnson Space Center 1, and JSC 1A. There are a number of other simulants, as you can see here, but it's by and large the JSC 1 simulant that's been used for a number of the studies that I'll describe. You can, of course, make your own these days, and 3D printers, which I still find this remarkable that you can do this. If you effectively know what physical chemical properties that you're working with, which you do, of course, from authentic lunar regolith, and you can match that with lunar regolith simulants, you can print here a section that's about 200 millimeters by 120 millimeters by 5 millimeters in as little as 30 minutes, which is astounding when you think of what, of course, the technology was available at the time in the 1960s and 1970s. To be able to 3D print this now, I think is really quite amazing. So this slide here is the entire summary, and it is up to date, entire summary of the work that has been conducted with lunar agriculture in regolith simulants, either authentic regolith or regolith simulants. So if we start up on the left, top left, plants were first exposed to lunar material in the 1970s. And of course, as you would expect, man has landed on the moon. We don't know whether or not there are any microorganisms in the regolith. We don't know whether there are any toxic properties that we've not covered or thought of from any of samples on Earth. So some of the very early studies actually conducted were conducted by exposing plants to lunar material. And in some cases, they were actually leaves that were rubbed with lunar stones, just to see whether or not they would have any toxic effects. And of course, as we know now, there were no toxic effects either on the short term or over a long period of time on plant growth. There was a big gap then between those experiments conducted in the 1970s and those conducted in the 2000s. And that, of course, coincided with the waning interest after the Apollo missions. And of course, it wasn't at that time in particular topical to think about going back to the moon. We'd done it, we'd been there, focus was on Mars. There were probably more politically motivated reasons for not going back to the moon in the 1980s and 1990s. And there was very little done. I would imagine it was probably quite difficult even to get grant funding to be able to do these types of studies. So move on to 2004, and there were some very nice studies that were conducted with simulars now starting to look at what would it really take to grow plants in Mars, on the moon, with a view to colonization for the future. I do have something on Mars in a moment. And some of the early studies considered French marigolds, and they considered French marigolds because they are fairly topical plants. But there was some thinking at the time, and it's quite forward thinking, that should we ever consider actually growing plants on the moon, the French marigold in its own right, despite it being perhaps an exotic plant, is hardy to start off with, but of course it's quite attractive to look at. And mission planners were thinking at that time and are today about the mental health of astronauts. If you're living on the moon for a long period of time, you would want something attractive to look at. It's quite well documented now that the mental health of astronauts, quite rightly, is taken into consideration. So then fast forward another 10 years, and the first large-scale study plant was conducted with a number of plants grown on lunar regolith simulant, and I'll describe those in a moment. And then fast forward another 5 years, and a study was conducted that explored harvesting and germination of these plants, again on the lunar regolith simulant. And then last but not least, we have the very public announcement that Chang'e 4's lunar microecosystem landed on the backside of the moon, and cotton seeds sprouted. But actually, it's not quite the story that actually happened, and I'll describe that too. So let's go into some of the detail now. So this is the study that was published in 2014. So again, looking at a range of plants here that are naturally occurring, some nitrogen fixers, peas, for example, some crops, and comparing their germination percentage, their ability to form leaves and form flowers, and what plants are still alive after 50 days. So the study was conducted for 50 days. And then on the right-hand panel, looking at the average biomass results per species at the end of the 50-day experiment. And you can see that in pretty much all cases, there are some exceptions, but lunar regolith simulant fares less well, as you can see, than plants grown on Earth soil, a representative sample of Earth soil, or for that matter, Martian regolith. And I'll come on to Martian regolith in a moment. It doesn't necessarily mean that you can't grow plants in lunar regolith simulant. It just means that the efficiency and the percentage yield, if you like, is expected to be lower. So that was the first study. Second study was conducted, oops, not sure what's happened to the bottom slide there. The second study was conducted looking at the total above ground combined dry biomass and the seed weight of cress, radish and rye harvested from plants. And this was like a study conducted in 2019. And to cut a long story short, again, crops were able to grow in lunar regolith stimulant, but the yield was approximately 50% of that compared with earth soil. And again, when we come to look at lunar regolith stimulant, we can see that we're low down to some extent. Now, of course, you can get around this simply by using fertilizer, and that's the little motif up in the right-hand side. So this has sown the seed, no pun intended, of the potential of using fertilizer to encourage the second yield of crops. So if we accept the fact that fertilizer we can't take with us would have to come from perhaps the primary crop, could we introduce the concepts of plants acting as pioneers, if you like, to provide enough organic matter in lunar regolith to serve as a substrate for growing plants for the future? So the very concept of using pioneer planting strategies has been adopted, and there is an article in a meeting abstract that was conducted, I think, in May this year, or published in May this year. But unfortunately, it's not open access, and I can't get hold of it. But it has extended the concept of growing pioneer plants as a way of nurturing, if you like, lunar regolith to be of higher quality for the next bulk of crops, or the next batch of crops. So lunar agriculture development, again, if I just summarize this for you, because I think it's probably easy to look at it in a table, started off in the 1970s, as I mentioned, with some quarantine studies conducted on liverworts, some studies conducted on lettuce seedlings, then started to move through into the 2000s where some crop studies were done. And the one that's particularly interested, and it took my eye, is this study here, looking at the French marigold, but now supplemented, at least in the simulant, with silicaceous bacteria, biocontrol agents, and mycorrhizal fungi. So there is the concept that lunar regolith itself may not support plant growth optimally, as you would expect, but the thinking ought to be, in addition perhaps to including pioneer plants to serve as the substrate for first crop growth, possibly to introduce some form of microbial organisms, albeit under the constraints of isolation from the lunar surface, that may prime that regolith to support subsequent crop growth. Now, it wouldn't be complete, and it wouldn't be fair as well, I should say, not to mention the CAG E4 system. But when the press release was that China manages to show that crops will grow on the reverse side of the moon, or the back side of the moon, wasn't technically correct. The lunar micro ecosystem, as it was called, is a very small capsule, and the capsule certainly landed on the back side of the moon, and the cotton seeds grew within it, or sprouted within it. But it's only because the lunar micro ecosystem was on the backside of the moon. So the crops or the cotton seeds would have grown anywhere that they happened to be sent. It's just that that's where the micro ecosystem was located. And as you would expect, with no protection whatsoever, they sprouted, allegedly they sprouted, but they died very soon afterwards. But nevertheless, it's an important experiment because it does start to make us wonder, are there conditions within highly specialized, isolated microsystems that may support crop growth perhaps for the future? And that certainly stimulated some of the thinking at present in the space agency missions. So I couldn't resist putting this in, because if you're, we're coming up towards Christmas, so if you're short of ideas for Christmas, in fact, I tried to find one of these a little bit earlier on in the year and I failed to do so. But I love the idea, certainly for science fairs and certainly for school projects, is that it's possible, of course, to buy lunar regolith stimulant of some form or another, and it's even possible to buy Martian regolith stimulant. And I thought this would be quite lovely to be able to have for young people who are interested just in exploring the concept of what lunar soil might be like, and whether or not we can get crops to grow. And of course, you can get crops to grow; otherwise, it'd be a pretty boring Christmas present. This is the Martian equivalent, and I've checked. And as you can see here, currently unavailable. It's been unavailable for some time, and the NASA logo is on here, but it's a little bit of a cheat, because this isn't supplied by NASA. As you can see at the top here, my version of Martian regolith stimulant is being supplied by a private supplier, but nevertheless the concept is there, and I think the idea of perhaps having this to inspire young people, I quite like it, and though I'm not a young person, I might buy myself one for Christmas. So let's move on to the next one. So building habitats on the moon. Let's just say we can get to a point now that we can overcome the challenges of growing crops in regolith. Where are we going to grow them? And of course, as we all know, there's no air, no protection from sun's radiation, no magnetic field, temperature variation, extreme, and micrometeoroids. Micrometeoroids make life rather difficult. And NASA is developing this lightweight inflatable pod, if you like. So it's not inconceivable, perhaps, that we see these types of environment on the surface of the moon. But nevertheless, I think it's still got some way to go. So what's captured the imagination of many scientists is the possibility of using lava tubes, either on the moon or Mars, should we colonize Mars, and a lot of work has been done on conducting investigations into their size and morphology. So this is taken from an ESA study, and of course it's a diagrammatic representation of what it might be possible to do by putting some form of subterranean habitat in a lava tube. And of course it then begs the question of what wavelength of light would you have to use to simulate plant growth. And I think it's probably common knowledge that you don't necessarily need white light to be able to make plants grow. Some plants respond better to white light, but also to red or ultraviolet light. So the possibility of protecting your source of food underground, or even yourself for that matter, has taken some seriousness over time. Now, again, this is something else that I'll keep in for you. This is from ESA, and this takes you through on a three-dimensional journey through a lava tube. And of course, it's a lava tube on Earth, not a lava tube on the moon. But it does quite nicely illustrate what possibilities there might be when and if we ever get more serious about using this as a habitat. This is ultimately the type of thing that's envisaged should we ever get to it in our lava tube, this type of greenhouse, if you like, which is in some cases hydroponic. So you can see the plants that are growing on the left, on the right, up at the top there, are growing without regolith in some instances where it's possible, and where it's possible they would grow with regolith. So this type of activity, of course, is science fiction at present, but should we ever get to the point of being serious about colonizing the moon, it may well become science fact. So just by way of agriculture to start off with, and again, the image on the right isn't a real one. I did get asked, is that a real image? And I looked at this person and did frown a little bit, and I said, no, it's not a real image. So lunar regolith has a fine dust component which sticks to everything. It's been extensively studied on Earth, and simulants made to enable further research, which has been very successful. Is it possible to grow plants on the moon? It looks like it might be, but at the same time, all of the evidence to date, at least in the limited studies that have been conducted, suggests that we would need pioneer plants, or at least some form of organic fertilizer, to get the substrate, if you like, to a threshold concentration that would support plant growth. And then finally, and I think this is probably fairly self-explanatory, the lunar surface, for many reasons, may not be the best place to build a habitat. So I want to move on a little bit now, and now just describe to you elements of human health, because I think this is really important. So this figure on the left-hand side here looks at various simulants compared with authentic lunar regolith. And what we're looking at is the percentage of fines or finer and the particle diameter. And this is particularly important in the context of what we may breathe in or what may get into our eyes. So as you can see, as the particle diameter decreases, the percentage of the regolith decreases. But even down to 1 micron, there are still elements of lunar regolith to some extent, but certainly of the authentic regolith that we might expect to find either in experiments conducted on Earth or on the moon. And you can see on the right-hand side here, this is another wonderful illustration of dust on the moon and the regolith that is within that component. Again, you can only imagine, as you can see on the shins of this particular astronaut here, the contamination that may happen should this come back into a lunar module or any habitat. So why is it important to think about the particle size? Well, if you take a look at the particles on the right-hand side, you imagine a 1 micron particle. It would certainly get into your lower airways and your parenchyma. Less than 0.8 microns would get deep into your lung, likely be exhaled by what we call tidal breathing, which is just our normal in and out breathing. But nevertheless, there will be a component that gets lodged in the lower airway. And when you look at the physics and the chemistry of some of those particles, you can see that you're effectively, in some cases, in breathing in glass dust that will lodge within the lung. Particles greater than about 5 microns are deposited into the oropharynx and swallowed, but nevertheless, I'm not sure I would be rushing to swallow effectively microglass particles. So there's a whole bunch of studies that have been conducted with lunar regolith simulants in cell studies. And I won't go through these in detail, but just to tell you that they've been conducted in cell types that represent the lung, the eye, the central nervous system. And in all cases, the real summary is that lunar dust may cause inflammation to the lung and eyes and affect nerve signaling on short-term exposure. So that's the summary, that's the conclusion of these studies that have been conducted in the lab, in vitro. And again, it doesn't necessarily mean that this would happen, but it serves as a warning, I think, for mission planners for the future, is that we need to consider the possibility, and it's probably not unreasonable, that lunar dust, as with any small particles, would cause inflammation in the lung, and how do we manage it? Now, I've also included a comparison of non-clinical in vivo studies that have been done, and these are in either the rabbit or in the rat, and again looking at the eye, the lung, or the heart in this time, in this slide. And the bottom line is still the same, and I won't go through the detail of it, but it's there for you to see in future. That lunar dust may cause inflammation in the lung and heart, and that may well lead to lung injury and abnormal heart function on short-term exposure. So these studies have been conducted over the short term, which is worth remembering. And what we don't have any data for is what might happen over longer periods of time, because of course many of these studies can't be conducted for days, weeks or months. So again, in the context of astronauts living on the moon, walking about on the moon, where they will, no matter how hard we try, more than likely get exposed at some point. The concept of having a safe exposure limit that could apply to long-term exposure really needs to be developed, which means that when we come to set the limits for safe exposure, we tend to be very, very conservative and set them at the lowest possible level because we don't have the data to support an understanding of what happens over the long term. So report all incidents, of course. This is our standard workplace motif and mantra, and of course that's exactly what you would do. When I come to summarize all of the adverse events associated with lunar dust, we've mentioned some of these already. Contact with the skin and crew dirty after removal. It's been well documented by a number of astronauts on multiple missions that what they tend to detect is the smell of gunpowder. So that's interesting, isn't it? That lunar dust, lunar regolith smells of gunpowder. And I mentioned the one from Alan Bean, and you've seen the ones at the moment, sorry, at the bottom. The one at the bottom here about irritation of the iron throat, again, must have been particularly worrying. It subsided, I believe, after about 2 hours, at least that's the information I can find. But that must have been a little bit worrying, of course, for that astronaut during Apollo 17's mission. So when in doubt, just keep it out. Let's think in the next slide, just a little bit about how we might be able to mitigate introduction of regolith into the lunar module or into any environment on the moon. So that's what we want to fight against in the middle. This is a wonderful image, credit NASA, of a dust particle. It's very similar to ones I've shown previously. So if we want to stop it entering the habitat in the first place, there are a number of ways of doing that. Certainly much helped by technology that wasn't available in the 1960s and 1970s. So the development of non-adherent spacesuits is one possible solution. Modification of surfaces that neutralize the charge is another one. Possibility of having a carbon dioxide shower or electrostatic neutralizers, which could either be a curtain or a gun. And there's a device called a sparkle, which is an electrostatic neutralizer. And then some next generation filters that use photovoltaic electrodes that effectively remove the dust on the basis of its charge. So there's a number of ways of perhaps, if not preventing it get into the habitat, preventing it get from a, if you like, an ante-room on the outside of the habitat into where the astronauts live and sleep, etc. Likewise, if we assume that we are going to get dust and regolith, or at least the dust component of regolith, into the environment, how can we monitor it? And we have to have in place a symptoms and duration scoring algorithm, just as we would have for hay fever on Earth. And of course, that's relatively easy to implement. Something that's very close to my heart professionally, because we use this in the clinical studies that we conduct in patients with asthma in particular, and more recently a little bit more in patients with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is a measurement of a surrogate proxy measurement of inflammation, which is to measure the use of fraction exhaled nitric oxide. And nitric oxide simply serves as a surrogate marker of how inflamed the lung tissues are. And there are some more futuristic ways of looking at the possibility of assessments of neurotoxicity by monitoring how the lipid bilayer changes with a planar instrumentation monitor. So this is a standard system that's used now for many patients who have asthma, either in clinical trials or even at home, you can buy pheno monitors at home that give you an indication of how healthy your lungs are with respect to an inflammatory component. So it is possible to think of ways to at least, if not mitigate import of regolith completely, at least monitor the effects that it may have. So just by way of a summary, because we're nearly there now, I think I'm just about on time. So by way of human health, lunar dust may be inhaled deep into the airways. And again, it depends on the size of the particle. The smaller the particle, the deeper it will go. Animal studies have shown that stimulants may cause lung injury, which is a little bit worrying, again, when we think about longer term missions for human beings. We do have a safe exposure limit for humans that's been calculated and that has been adhered to and will be adhered to on any return missions. But nevertheless, of course, until we do it, we don't actually know what the effects of long-term exposure to lunar dust are. So those remain, I think, a little bit of a red flag for any mission planners moving forward. So are we going back to the moon? And of course we are going back to the moon. That's the whole purpose of the Artemis mission. But I put this in because I thought this is quite interesting. So this is Buzz Aldrin's thinking around going back to the moon. If we go back to the moon, we're guaranteed second, maybe third place, because while we're spending all that money, Russia has its eye on Mars, etc., etc. So he's not a fan, at least by the looks of this, of going back to the moon, at least if this quotation is genuine, and I do believe it is. But perhaps a little bit more balanced is Jack Schmitt, now years on from his Apollo missions at the 2004 Lunar Dust Symposium, where I think quite rightly he's saying that a common sense engineering approach means that we can pretty much solve everything. I mean, we got to the moon in the first place through common sense and engineering. Surely it is possible, I think is his argument, that we can find ways to develop mitigating the effects of lunar dust and lunar regolith, either by stopping it enter habitats in the first place, or at least understanding what limits astronauts can be safely exposed to. So I'll finish with just a couple of slides, because this for me is still an image that I find astonishing to look at. Again, 50 years ago, an astronaut here, I mean, he's in this particular case collecting samples. And before I finish on my final slide, just want to say thank you very much. This particular astronaut here, I think he's off somewhere, maybe to get some liquid refreshment. But nevertheless, I think this just summarizes for me the excitement I feel about this type of exploration, is that who knows what's coming up next, but we're going to go and find it. So my last slide is just a bit of a punt for myself. Thank you very much for listening. If you want to contact me, I have a website. You can find me on astrospeakers.com as well, or astrospeakers.org. Thank you so much for listening. And I think I'm just about on time, Gordon, for everybody. So I'll stop there and take any questions from anybody, or do my best to answer any questions, I should say.
Well, thank you very much for that, Martin. That really was fascinating. Who would have thought that lunar soil stroke dust could be so interesting, but also a bit scary on how hazardous that fairly innocuous looking material could be to any astronauts that visit there in the future for any length of time. Now, I know there has been quite a few questions have come in, so I am going to call upon, well, let me just have a look. There's not a large number of people here, so if there's anybody that has put a question in that would like to ask it in person rather than us reading through the chat box, if you want to stick your hand up and we can organise for you to be unmuted and you can ask your question. If there's nobody who wants to do that, then we can obviously read through the details that have been put in the chat. So I'll just pause for a minute while people find out how they can stick their hand up. And if there's no hands come up, we'll maybe go through the questions in the chat. And John, have you been monitoring the chat box? Is there questions there that you can pick out for Martin?
Yes, we've got, I think the first one was from our own Keith Nicholson. He was asking, would cosmic ray exposure have an impact on lunar surface plant growth and cause genetic mutations?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think for certain, it would not be possible to grow plants on the surface of the moon, or for that matter, on the surface of Mars, without any form of real protection against galactic cosmic radiation. So I think that is what influences the thinking that we would have to have either a very well protected habitat for growing plants and setting up a food supply chain on the surface, or using the natural environment and the natural protection by having our supply chain underground. So you're absolutely right. And of course, we have the additional complication of micrometeorite impact. So if you see, and I always muse a little bit about this, I see these wonderful science fiction images of greenhouses on the moon. And then you just have to think, well, if one of those is hit by something coming in at a very, very fast speed, of course, because there's no atmosphere to slow it down, what happens if the glass shatters, or it doesn't even need to shatter? What happens if it cracks? And again, I didn't put images in, but I do have some images of what damage some of the vehicles sustained while they were on the surface of the moon by micrometeorite impacts. And it's actually quite shocking when you see what a very, very small particle can do, of course, at speed, to anything, which includes the solar panels as well, for that matter, on the Lunar Rover. So I think you're absolutely right. Anything that I can see, at least for now, would really preclude any growth of crops on the surface.
Okay, we've got some guy, Gordon Mackey, asking a question.
Sorry, could I just jump in to query one thing you said there, Martin? So the difference between grow and breed, though, I mean, the crops can grow and many crops can be surprisingly radiation hardy, but the mutation would be a second generation effect, not the level of radiation they can grow and be edible in. It's a different prospect from having to grow the crop and then keep the seed corn to grow the next generation.
No? Yes, no, yeah. Exactly. No, you're right. Absolutely. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so I can see another one here.
Yeah, I think Gordon was asking, any ideas why lunar dust would have a gunpowder type odor?
Yeah, it's a good question, isn't it? There's no explanation for it, and it has puzzled NASA scientists, because they've asked the same question, because it's been reported, I think, by 3 astronauts, smells like gunpowder. So when you think about what's in gunpowder, there's no carbon, obviously, there's no potassium nitrate. Why would it smell like gunpowder? It's a good question. I don't think we have the answer.
Okay, thanks. But perhaps I need to buy some of the simulant regolith from Amazon and do some experiments to see if I can find out.
Can I maybe ask again, just to be annoying and jump in? So I mean, might it be that it's just kind of fake? You know how you get, like, when people say they taste something, that they can taste something metallic or smell, you know, that because the sense and the taste get so mixed up. I wonder if it's just spoofing something else that, and then that's the only thing they've got that they can associate with it, that's somehow a taste from all that fine particles, and then they think it smells like something.
No, that's a good thought. You might well be right there, because there has to be something that is in common if more than one person's reported it. But obviously, of course, it isn't gunpowder, so there has to be something that's maybe a bit of sensory disruption.
Another one from Keith. Have any lunar regolith particles that simulate asbestos particle morphology been observed? And there's a couple there that are linked to that. A couple more questions that are kind of linked to that.
Yeah, so as far as I'm aware, and there was actually a lovely paper published just this week on some electron microscopy work from a Russian lab. And I don't think, as far as I'm aware, that the fibrous nature that we see in asbestos hasn't been found in either lunar regolith, authentic lunar regolith, or in the simulants. But at the same time, I wouldn't be keen on inhaling small particles deep into my airway that I know has the morphology of glass, because irrespective of whether it's sharp glass or not, if it lodges into the alveolar tissue or the alveoli, let alone the alveolus at the root of the lung, they're not going to come out. So it then sort of begs the question, could there be a local inflammatory response that then becomes more serious? Yeah. And actually, because the only way you can get it out then is by surgery. And if you have a lot of particles in your alveoli, that becomes quite a big undertaking. So in short, as far as I'm aware, there's no fibrous structure that are associated with either white or blue asbestos, but the nature of the particle size is something that would worry me. And I don't know if we have whether we have any physicians on the call who could either challenge that or support it. Any docs on the lung doctors would be even better if we have any lung doctors on the call. Nope. So we've got another one. So, this is one. There's another one from you here. So many of us enjoyed the book and movie The Martian with the botanist who will science the shit out of this. Any comments on the sci-fi thoughts regarding the production of potatoes on the moon, on Mars or on the moon? So I think that there's, if we think about this realistically, and let's think about Mars in the first instance because it relates to the Martian. There's no doubt, I think, whether it's the Mars or the moon, we have to have something to augment Martian regolith or lunar regolith. So whether that's human waste or plant waste, there has to be something that provides bulk, if you like, some way of retaining water, some way of adding organic material. So I'm sure this is in the planning for mission planners, that human waste, of course, has to be disposed of somewhere. So can it be converted in a way that makes it suitable fertilizer? And I think the advances in synthetic biology will help us there. So there are microbes that have already been naturally discovered that are extremely efficient at removing all sorts of toxic chemicals, radionuclides even. So I would not mind betting that in the run-up to Martian colonization, which seems to be the way that the whole field is going, we'll see the advent of microbes specifically designed to increase organic matter in Martian regolith. So we're already looking at microbes that will both metabolize perchlorate, one of the major contaminants in Martian regolith, as I'm sure you know, and can fix nitrogen. So we've got microbes that can fix nitrogen, we've got microbes that can metabolize perchlorate, but we don't have nitrogen fixing microbes that can metabolize perchlorate. But that pathway can be engineered in, at least in theory, and there are a number of labs trying to do that at the moment. So in the same way that they're trying to do that, I think we'll see microbes specifically designed to be able to break down human waste and make that a more acceptable fertilizer.
Isn't it almost fun that we're catching up with the Kim Stanley Robinson books from the early 90s?
Yeah, exactly. So, shall I pick another one? I can see one here. Thinking of the use of regolith, so this is from David Orr. Thinking of the use of regolith, does it contain all the macro and micro minerals to support plant growth? Are there major deficiencies? There aren't so much major deficiencies, at least from the elemental composition. the major deficiencies are in organic matter. So in theory, the elements are there. There's no doubt perhaps that there are some substances that are missing dependent on what crop you want to grow. But I think part of the reason for those studies in the mid-2010s was to think about, let's look at a range that would have utility in the supply chain, so as either nitrogen fixers or as crops, see which ones are the most likely to grow, and that of course might limit a future food chain, because it's almost a certainty, I think, that we wouldn't have the range of crops grown on Martian regolith or lunar regolith that we have on Earth. So at least from what I see, there is the possibility, at least on a mineral basis, of being able to use lunar regolith, but we definitely need that organic component to start it off, to start things off. And that's why the idea of pioneer crops are actually quite interesting. So there must be lessons to be learned from nuclear decontamination. Can't imagine the lunar dust is hard to deal with in that. So no, exactly. So I think in terms of thinking about how we can decontaminate lunar regolith, that it's not so much that there's anything to decontaminate. It's again, how do we manage the particle fines and maybe add enough bulk in that those particle fines are absorbed. And again, I was lucky enough to be asked to give a talk on extremophiles a little bit earlier on in the week, and researching that this year, and actually I've been following this area for several years, the advances now in understanding how we can engineer extremophiles. And Charles Cockell at the University of Edinburgh is one of the groups thinking about this for the future. I think we'll see some quite big advances in how we can tailor extremophiles now towards some more space-related problems, whereas we've had extremophiles working on our behalf in the food industry for over a decade. So applying their qualities towards perhaps giving us a better quality regolith, I'm sure is in the interests of researchers. So would human waste, yep, so we've done that one. So another one, would material which was ultra super hydrophobic also repel the lunar dust? It may do, but then at the same time, if it's hydrophobic, then we would want it to be able to have a water content as well. So are you thinking, and I'm not sure who the question is from.
It's me, Martin. It's me. Yeah.
Are you thinking about the surface of
yeah, the space suits, just to make it easier to clean? You know, if it's based on the kind of, you know, the dust being slightly ionized, whether you get the same kind of these pointy materials that would repel the charge on water, and it makes it very easy to clean. I wonder whether that's the future modern space, or lightweight spacesuit, the kind of skin suit.
And that's with something like a carbon dioxide shower, which effectively blasts it off, and then a filtration system that extracts it. Yeah, absolutely. Good question. I think, is that everything? So we've done that one. Asbestos and mesothelioma. I think I answered that one. So that was another one from you. Simulate morphology.
I think it's just from Keith saying another great talk, Martin. Thanks very much. Peter Watt as well. Very good talk. Thanks very much.
Yep, I think that's probably echoed by everybody that's tuned into the presentation tonight, and as Keith mentioned, the other one earlier this week, and the one on extremophiles that you did for us back in the middle of the summer. While others are considering whether they'll get any other questions, I'm going to pitch in with one with regards the plant yield, and I'm just wondering. Obviously, gravity on the moon is less than on the Earth. Would that have an effect on the yield, or for instance, when the experiments were done on the simulants, it worked out that the yield was a certain percentage less. Would the fact that there's less gravity on the moon counteract that loss of yield to an extent, or does 1/6 gravity not really matter?
It is a brilliant question, Gordon, and the reason it's a brilliant question is, of course, gravity will influence water transport. And the water transport within the xylem and the flow of the plants under reduced gravity will be different from that on Earth. So there is no doubt that will play into the equation at some point. It's just that we've not conducted those experiments yet. So I would not mind betting. So the idea, for example, of hydroponic growth, where you're trying to grow plants in a water vapor mist, are going to be very different on the surface of the moon than they would be on Earth. So I think all of these studies wait to be done. But you're absolutely right. And I'm not sure that these studies must have been done. But maybe I ought to look this up. I haven't seen anything on the International Space Station for any of the crop growth experiments where they've looked at water uptake. I've seen something on water translocation in lettuce seedlings. But it's a really good question, because I'm absolutely certain that water transport will be different. And then it's not just water transport, but it's the minerals that the water would bring in as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was thinking along the same lines, but more, would the plants actually form the same amount of root system?
Yep.
Because they wouldn't need to hold themselves up so much. Yep. Because of the lesser gravity, yep. Which means maybe less water,
yep.
water transfer.
Yes. Well, there are also some very interesting and again synthetic biology questions around water. Because of course plants take water in, and of course they lose it through their stomata, and it's now possible, and this has already been done for plants on Earth. It's been done in tomatoes for the specific reason of getting them to grow in areas where the conditions are more arid, so they lose less water. So it's possible to engineer the photosystem pathway such that you can regulate the opening and closing of the plant's stomata, and effectively mean that they lose less water, which means that they take up less water. So again, I can see a real merging of the fields here between synthetic biology for what we've already been doing for many years. Maybe people don't realize this, but we've been doing this for many years on Earth. And the possibility now of being able to take all of that learning and engineer it into environments on the moon or on Mars, taking into account the difference in gravity and the difference in water translocation, but actually designing crops to be suitable for the environment. And I think that's a really fascinating area for the future, where synthetic biology merges with astrobiology.
Yeah. I haven't noticed any other questions coming in. I'll maybe just ask one last tongue-in-cheek. Oh, actually, no, I've got one before the tongue-in-cheek question. When it comes to yield as well, obviously in the moon we don't have any pests, so we don't have green fly and caterpillars and whatever else eating part of the yield of the crop. So I suppose that is one positive advantage to grow in there if we manage to do that. But
what about the clangers?
We've got the clangers. I suppose the soup dragon may come along and pinch some of our spinach for its soup. The final sort of tongue-in-cheek question, because it really just blew my mind that you could use a 3D printer to print out regolith simulant, so fake lunar surface with a 3D printer. I thought that's just something special. So I suppose the question is, how many printers would it take and how long for us to fake a moon, or maybe a bit more realistically, if we were to fake a moon landing with some simulated lunar surface, I'm assuming that would be fairly straightforward now, but thankfully back in the late 60s and 70s, there weren't 3D printers. So the moon landing hoaxers can't claim that that's how the fake scene was generated.
All right, so I think we're on secure ground with the lunar landings, but you know it is a good point because the technology is so good today. So you know we have ABBA giving virtual tours as avatars, and I don't know if you've seen them sing as an avatar, but you can't tell the difference between as the group was 40 years ago and them singing today. I mean, it's just astounding. But besides that. And actually, if you think about the pollination question, because the pollination question is a really interesting one, because I can imagine astronauts will be sent with his or own paintbrushes, because something will have to do the pollinating, of course, if there's no insects. So the idea of growing crops that will pollinate means that there has to be something doing the pollinating. And if there's no astronauts, if there's no insects, astronauts will have to do it manually. But it's a very good question, and it is worth raising. I think in everything that we see is just challenging the authenticity of things, because what we take for granted today may not necessarily be genuine. But I think we're on secure ground with the lunar landings.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Actually, I hadn't thought about the pollination aspect, but that's. So I suppose in some ways it's something that on Earth we kind of take for granted.
Yep.
But there's all these insects going around doing a very important job for us. And on the moon, where there isn't any, then we would have to find a way to do it ourselves.
Yep.
Okay, so I'm not seeing any other questions coming in, unless you've seen anything, John. Nope. So I think that's a good point to wrap up, and once again say thank you very much for a fabulous and very interesting talk. Like I said, I would never have imagined that lunar regolith could be so interesting, but the number of aspects there that just caught my attention. I've jotted down lots to go find out more, which again I didn't anticipate it being such an interesting topic.